Good morning, everyone. How did everybody enjoy the event last night? Good. My name is Michael Lane. I'm with SA Communel. We're a company, we're a mechanical contractor. Our parent company is Import Group. And I'm here today to introduce you to Alex Schuessler. His name sounds a little harder than it is, but it isn't. It's pretty simple. Alex has 20 plus years of technology and equipment industry foundry. He's a founder. He has 2 successful startups, and one thing I do know about Alex is hard to catch up with. He travels a lot. During our meetings, conference calls, he was always coming back from Japan or something. So, what Alex is here to talk about today is the supply chain to support your supply chain. Parts and service to maximize equipment efficiencies and uptime. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alex.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I feel like I should say I just came back from Japan or something. I've been pretty obsessive about this area of supply chain in general, but especially supply chain from the perspective of an equipment management professional. I started, just as a quick introduction and why I've become this obsessive about that, I started about 25 years ago as a junior faculty member at New York University and working on what now is called big data, before it was called that. And my special interest was in how do we take all of that, there are all these computers sprouting everywhere, and how do we take all of that data that's being generated by all of these machines all over the world, growing rapidly, and how do we bring that into a workflow that anybody can use? You can't build a whole infrastructure of data and assume that everybody's going to be a data scientist one day and knows what to look for where. And that was really pretty interesting. We built a lot of methods on how do we do it, how do we flow this kind of data into the day-to-day work stream. And the idea generally was, I know we were building websites in those days, this was during the .com era. We're building websites, but we don't want to rely on people always having to go to a website to find what they need. And then through a really weird set of circumstances, alongside while doing this research, I was introduced to the equipment industry. And I started spending a lot of time in parts and service departments. And this seemed terribly familiar, because all of a sudden I was working with equipment management professionals, and they were trying to find parts information, service information, maintenance information, all that kind of stuff that was distributed among several hundred suppliers, for example, in the context of a large rental company, or at least a dozen different suppliers, as well as other suppliers that were trying to get to you in real time, service information, parts information, and so on. And while you had to deal with all of that, you also had to manage your own parts inventory, keep stock information up to date, inventory information, and all that. So I suddenly thought, wait a minute, all this stuff that we've been doing theoretically in academia, we're now really finding in one of the, to me at the time, really unexpected places. And then I thought, well, technology is going to fix it, because technology fixes everything, and nobody was paying attention to this. Even though we were right in the middle of this .com boom, and then especially with procurement systems coming up. And then I started thinking, well, why aren't these procurement systems doing anything? And that is, and everybody in this room knows this, but they didn't. If you look at what a typical fleet owner spends in one given year on spare parts and parts, they say spare parts in Europe, on parts, it's usually about 1% of your spend. The rest is equipment, legal services, facilities, coffee cups, and anything else. So they're not paying much attention. But if today you look at a large fleet owner and look at how many purchase orders do you cut in a given year, quite often it's 85–90% of the time that you buy something, it's usually a part. So and that's where we really started getting focused. There's a lot of relevance to this on a day-by-day basis. First of all, what I would like to do today is look at technology, but specifically start by saying, hey, there are supply chains everywhere, and specifically for construction projects, there are really 3 overarching supply chains. You've got to get labor to the site, you've got to get materials there, and you have to have equipment. And again, obviously our interest here is on the equipment side. And I'm going to do a brief overview of the technology platform that's being used for these sites, something called BIM, or Building Information Management Systems. And then secondly, I want to start going a generation deeper, and especially for equipment. We think of supply chain as something that starts way up, and it keeps going through distribution and through different processing spots all the way to a construction site. But there are also supply chains that stop short of that. For example, to keep your equipment up and going, which is one of the inputs for your construction site, or for your construction project, you need to keep that equipment up and running. And that is usually parts and service, life cycle management, so forth. It doesn't have any direct input onto the construction site other than making sure that your equipment keeps running. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the methods of equipment life cycle management and what technology is done there. The third part, I then want to focus on some of the solutions that are active. But I don't just want to tell you, here's a solution. I also want to be as quantifiable in all of these as possible, and really looking at what's at stake. And one of the things that I find initially counterintuitive, and it's certainly counterintuitive to people that are outside of the equipment management professional space, is that the importance of efficiency around equipment management, around parts, service, etc., is far more than just making sure you're buying parts at a lesser price than you might otherwise be, or making sure that your service flow is there. It really goes so deeply into the economics of profitability for a construction project that people are quite often surprised, and I want to share some of that with you as well. And then finally, after having gone through these three large buckets, I'll do a quick summary and really try to also summarize what is it that I do with all of this information and how do I manage all of this. So let's start with the first one, which is supply chain and construction projects. Specifically, how do we optimize all of the inputs that go into a construction project? So I always like to start really simple, and I love pictures. So here's the construction project. And what is it that has to be brought there? Again, at the very highest simplistic level. And the first thing is labor. There's labor, there are contractors, subcontractors, specialists. It doesn't really just start with the construction itself. It obviously starts right before that, or quite a bit before that, with design, architectures, engineers, and so on. But in any event, what economists call factors of input, one of the three main factors of input, the types of input, is just simply people, it's labor. The second one, obviously, is materials. That's the other supply chain that goes in there. You want the right materials there. Ideally, you don't want them to show up a year in advance, but at the same time, you also don't want to be waiting for them, so there's a lot of management in that supply chain, just like there is for labor. But again, labor, material are two supply chains. And the third one, again, the reason we all come here, is the equipment side. Okay? So very simple still, very high overview, but these are really all three of the supply chains that are relevant to construction projects. Where the challenges start, and we can start with the most familiar area to us, which is the equipment side, is really the art of having the right piece of equipment, the right unit, the right asset, at the right time, right when it's being used. You don't want it sitting there before it's needed, and you certainly don't want to be keep it sitting there afterwards. You really want to keep it moving and make sure you're optimizing in that. And there's a lot of responsibility in ensuring that it's there. And just like within equipment, you want to get that kind of coordination right. You want to do the same thing on the materials and the labor side. And then to make it more complicated still, you also want to make sure that it's actually efficient across all three of these. There's an overall coordination that's required. So if there's a delay in some of the materials being delivered, obviously you have to adjust your plans for the labor side, and you have to adjust your side for the equipment side. So from a technology, if you want to solve for you, if you want to optimize what you're doing here from a technology perspective, you just need to acknowledge and really drive the fact that the profitability of the project is really hugely dependent both on the scheduling and logistics within any of these three sets of inputs, but also across all of them overall. And that is really the definition of what people call BIM, Building Information Management. You have the project, you see some of the callouts. This is, I think, this is a graphic produced by one of the major BIM producers, Autodesk. You have the construction projects, you have different teams that need to move in at different times. They all share a common model of the project itself, so an overarching project plan. There's project data that goes in that constantly gets updated because different things are happening at different times. There are delays, there are other issues that need correction. And then there's a communication platform because Team A has to let Team E know somehow in an automated way that, hey, this deadline got pushed out by 2 days because we're still waiting on X. So there's a platform for this. And the other thing that's easy to lose sight of is that platform doesn't just start, as I've noted earlier, with the building part of it, or the construction part of it, it really is already built into the design, into the architectural aspect. Architects work closely with engineers, and they make sure that the project plan really spawns from these original drawings, from these original designs, and is really built in. That's one part that a lot of users of BIM sometimes lose sight of. The other is, more and more, and that's a more recent development, you don't just factor in design and then building the project, or creating the project, you're actually also factoring what it takes, if you're building a skyscraper, what it also then takes to operate the project. So there's really a life cycle that goes across far more years than we used to think about for construction projects, and where every link that's coming to the job site is simultaneously in some way going to be responsible for how operations of that building are going to function down the road. Okay? So it's really intricate, and they're becoming pretty powerful. So overall, there's a reduced project risk with these kinds of technologies that continue to improve. Obviously, much of it feeds through timeline, cost savings, improvements, and so forth. So in general, just have a better outcome. And just to give you a snapshot, not to necessarily defend these particular numbers, but when you look through white papers of the claiming the kinds of results you have, they're going to give you these kinds of numbers. Cost predictability is up, improved schedule, error reduction, design gets optimized, which again goes back to when you're doing the design, you're also looking at the operational aspects of building and the operational aspects of operating the product. And so all of this gets factored in as well, and the overall operational management of the project as a whole improves. So that's a quick summary of an overarching technology of BIM. By the way, one of the things that's interesting, you're seeing more and more, large rental companies, as they become more and more sophisticated equipment rental companies over the last few decades, they've gone from renting new equipment, hoping that you're actually getting all of this wrong so that your equipment is sitting in your yard, not being used, but you're paying the bills, to now actually proactively telling you, that's the second step, hey, you don't need this until next week. We'll bring it in and then we'll pick it up when you no longer need it. So actually helping you become more efficient with the use of their assets. To nowadays actually tying into some of these BIM platforms. So it's no longer, we've moved a long way from just renting equipment and much more in your rental company becoming a very active partner and having direct visibility of all of this and making sure that the right equipment shows up and disappears again outside of the times that you need it. Now let's focus a little bit more on the equipment side. Again, that's why we're here. So to take that earlier very simple drawing and simplify it further, one of the three inputs was equipment. And that's the supply chain to the construction equipment. Again, very simply put, very simple drawing. And on the left is a picture of us, the guy with the wrench in their hand. That's the supply chain to the equipment, and it's not one that feeds through to the construction equipment because it really is about getting service labor and parts and everything else that the equipment requires to the machine. But it's not something that then passes through to the equipment. It's just enabled, to the project. It just enables the equipment to do its job at the large site. Okay. So let's start quantifying some of that. Because many of us who've been doing this for a long time think, okay, what's my expenditure on parts over the last year on that kind of equipment? And that's my cost of parts. Okay. And if we take that approach, and maybe add a little bit of service, but if we take that approach, we're drastically underestimating how expensive the parts supply chain really is, especially when you get it wrong, or when you're not optimizing it. So just to put some numbers out there. I spend a lot of time around North America, I spend a lot of time in Europe, I spend a lot of time in Asia and Australia now as well. And what's interesting is a lot of this depends on fleet mix, but a very typical number, I spend a lot of time with rental companies, large and small. So depending on fleet mix, a typical ballpark number for annual consumption of parts by a unit is about 3%. Okay? In some cases a lot higher, depending on the size of the equipment, in some cases a lot lower, but just fleet-wide, this is a reasonable number. 3% of your OEC, original equipment cost, is going to be parts consumption. Okay? Year over year. As the equipment gets older, that number goes up. When it's younger, hopefully it's quite a bit smaller, but that's a rough number. However, a part is useless until it gets attached to equipment. Another term for attaching parts to equipment is service, right? That's what service is. And if you're looking again at a typical fleet and trying to find what's my annual expenditure on service, it actually tends to be, again, depending on equipment, but it tends to be roughly another 3%. So it's about 50-50. It's a little bit different for access equipment than it is for ground engaging equipment, but again, we're talking ballpark numbers. Given that there is no parts without service and there's no service without parts, you might as well bundle them together and saying the process of getting parts on your equipment is about, per year, is roughly 6% of the original value of it. And then as we started building, as I was involved both for our company but also in other projects and spent a lot of time with different fleets, we learned, not because of our efforts, but because of the fleets that taught us, specifically fleets like Sunbelt Rentals. Again, I spent a lot of time with those kinds of fleets, and United Rentals, for example, and specifically people like Brad Coverdale, Mike Bierstock, who have been in all this environment for a very, very long time. They said, well, wait, when you get something wrong on the parts ordering part, meaning, for example, you get the price wrong, you're going to still get your part, and you're still ultimately going to be 3%, but you've just imposed a cost on our accounts payable department. Okay? And not only that, every time a manufacturer, let's say JCB, introduces a new part, even if it's for the same machine, but there's a supersession, and they change that, they have now imposed a cost on my back office, because I have to update my ERP system. I cannot cut a PO unless that item already exists in my ERP system. I can't cut that purchase order. And so I have to now add it and keep my item master files alive. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the back office that when we as service people get things wrong or don't update those, we're also adding another cost. And again, we've done a lot of analyses, learning from people like that and companies like that a great deal. And it's you're getting pretty close to another percent. I put it in conservatively another 0.75% distributed over all this activity of back office costs per year. Okay, so now we've gone from 3% to almost 7%. But all of that dwarfs compared to the cost of getting it wrong in the face of uptime. If you can't control uptime, then you have two types of the costs that you face. Either if you are running a lean fleet and you need that machine there, but the machine is down, at the very minimum, you're going to cost some kind of penalty for not being there when you said you would be. The other possibility is you may be running a larger fleet, exactly because you need that buffer, because you know there will be moments like that. So you're running a fleet, maintaining a fleet that you shouldn't really have to need if you could get the uptime under control. Or you may say, well, we don't have that, our unit's down, we'll go ahead and rent it. So see, there's three different scenarios, but all of them come with an additional cost. And as we'll dig deeper, we'll find that cost is actually quite a bit larger than any of these. So whenever anybody tells you that I'm looking at fleet management and the cost of parts is 3%, that's a drastic understatement. Okay, it's a multiple of that because of the intricate relationship and the inseparable relationship with all these other factors. Let's look at service labor costs. Here's that guy again. So in the early 2000s, I helped launch a project and to find out across different fleet owners, contractors, rental companies, and others, how much time their service people, in this case the guy with the wrench in his hand, how much time they were spending with that wrench in their hand. And as we walked around, we suddenly realized, wait a minute, it's 50% for rental companies. That's where we started. We said, how can it be 50%? They're incredibly well educated. They were the highest paid employees. They were working hard, but they only found 50% to do this kind of work. And then we started following them around with clipboards and stopwatches, and, silly things, and said, what are they doing when they're not actually repairing equipment? Well, they're running to various manufacturing systems. In those days, you even use microfiche sometimes. But they're running to different manufacturer systems, CDs, online, whatever else, to find out what part do I need for this, and oh, by the way, what's the serial number and where does it go? Oh no, there's a supersession, but don't worry because I have that same part under the older part number on my shelf that so-and-so misordered. So there was an enormous amount of search time from manufacturers, from dealers, in my own inventory. And just to make things more complicated still, every manufacturer had a different system. So finding a part at, I mentioned the example of JCB, just arbitrary, is a very, very different way, it requires very different steps from finding a part for your access equipment, let's say JLG. The way these manufacturers handle serial numbers is fundamentally different. One manufacturer will tell you if it's bigger than serial number 1,000 and less than 2,000, it's this part. Another manufacturer will require the exact serial number to be able to tell you which part you should be using. And a third manufacturer is not using serial numbers because they don't want you to know how many of these things they've built, so they just call it a lot number. Okay? Now, every one of your mechanics needs to know all of this for dozens and dozens of different suppliers to keep this thing going. Okay? So you can already have a feel that that 3% that we talked about earlier, which is the price of the part itself, is minute compared to the labor cost of actually finding all of this. And we could go on for about an hour looking at all of these other places we have to go and do that. And so when we looked at this 20 years ago, we said there has to be a technology platform. Not just an app, not just an application, not just some kind of program. There has to be a way to help move this forward. So rather than this guy putting his wrench down all the time and chasing it, that information has to come to them. We want a world where a piece of equipment comes in. I don't have to know the serial number. I don't even have to know what it is. All I know is we called it number 12345, and we key in number 12345, and that platform tells us, that's a JLG 1932 E2 scissor lift with the serial number 54321. And when you do the coil replacement, that's a 20-volt coil, not a 24-volt coil for that serial number, and you have 2 of those in your inventory. That's the world we would have to build to make all of this other stuff go away. Okay? To make that process nightmare go away. That's the safest thing. So I mentioned parts cost, I mentioned service cost, and I also mentioned what we learned by spending a lot of time with our partners and our customers, the whole back office cost. If you are a large fleet, but even if you're a small fleet, you're spending a lot of time researching where should we be buying various parts. Some you buy from dealers, some you buy directly from OEM, sometimes you go to alternative suppliers, but whatever it is, there's always some kind of research required. And once you've researched it, then there are 2 compliance requirements. You have to make sure that all your employees buy the parts from those people. And you also have to make sure that when your employees go to those people, they're charging the right price. So there's double compliance in all of this, which is a challenge, especially if you have several hundred job sites, locations, but also if you have 5 job sites. It's constantly running around and doing a lot of this. And so a lot of people that are focused in one way or another and on getting that kind of information. Then at the same time, you have to maintain your own stock. This picture was taken at a Dutch location of a large rental company. And before we walked in, the fleet manager said, by the way, when you walk in there, we have 0 parts. Then he opened the door and showed me that. And I said, that's a lot of 0 parts. He said, yeah, but they're not in our system, so they don't exist. So it is impossible to manage this stuff unless you have some automation in there. And he said, but we were very lucky. See, there's one box that was there yesterday, but the guy that was sick when the other part was ordered, and we were just about to say we don't have it, he said, no, we already misordered that about a week ago. Go to that level, I think it's over there. So we actually managed to get rid of one of them. Okay? But that whole stock control, maintenance, and so forth is another cost that goes into all of this. That's not captured in that 3% number that we mentioned earlier. We talked about finance and account payable. The poor lady in the purple sweater, she's constantly, you just placed an order for $15, it comes in, you don't get that 3-way match. A lot of technology coming out of other fields, of other procurement areas in the world that are nowhere near as complicated as buying parts, they say, oh, well, we just have a matching function at the end where we automate or help you control it. What we learned, again, in this particular case from our friends at Sunbelt, they say, well, wait a minute, if you're getting it right in the beginning, she doesn't have that headache. So don't take medicine after you have the illness. Take something preventative, get it right. Make sure that when you place the order, it's already getting the data from the supplier as well as your own record, and make the match up front. So you never actually have to take that medicine in the end. Focus technology on getting it right, not on fixing. Okay? And so we make that, in that sense, you make a lot of, give her a lot of favors somehow. And then finally, we talked briefly about master data management. All of this stuff has to exist, not just in one place, but to be able to do a purchase order. And of course, all of that has to be synchronized. So if you want to deep dive into what that additional 0.75 to 1% in back office load is, every single time you place an order or make a request for a part as a management professional, some version of that is going on in the background. Okay? So that's the third one. We talked about parts, we talked about service, we talked about back office. If you take it one step, we can look at it another way. And I like showing this particular diagram to people that are doing procurement for simple things. Okay? There's usually some companies differentiate between direct spend, everything that's equipment related, and indirect spend, and they say it's not that difficult. Just make the catalog and order it. Well, they don't have serial number specifics, they don't have supersession, they don't have kits, they don't have maintenance intervals, they don't have any of that. Buying pencils from a Staples website is very, very different. So I like to show them that. I said before you can actually do any of this, you have the service component, which is all the stuff now put in a straight line, all the stuff we talked about. You have to diagnose what you need, you have to identify the part, and you have to find it. And finding it is either your inventory, in some cases a dealer, in some cases direct from the OEM, in some cases another location, maybe you're running a warehouse, all of these things you have to go through. And then you have to source it. You may source it by just walking to your own shelf or to another location or job site. You may get it from down the street, you may get it but there's a lot of logistics again there to ordering parts, processing parts, and to maintain all the master data management in the background to be able to do this. And then, while you're doing all of this, if you're not under enough pressure and deeply depressed as it is by the challenge, you also have to realize that every single time you make a mistake, it's the only purchasing that's being done in your company, that when you make a mistake, your revenue goes down. If you're a rental company, it's a machine that you can no longer rent out for the next 24 hours because you made an error. If it's a contractor fleet, you're not getting return on assets in a very similar way, calculated differently, but it's the only type of purchasing. Nobody cares if you get the wrong coffee cups. Revenue is untouched, unless you're working with a bunch of coffee addicts. But in this particular case, it's the only purchasing that you do where you have a revenue. So every time you order a part, unlike all the other purchasing you do, you have to go through this. Okay. Now, I don't know why, but several people have said to me, you've got to mention blockchain. Okay. And so this is a quick side note on blockchain. And there is a lot of hope for blockchain. It's not clear how quickly this will take care in our industry, but all of the things that I've just described to you, all of those pain points entail either the search for information among many, many, many different sources. Sometimes you don't know what the right source is to get that information, and it's the pain of actually doing a transaction. So you have to find what's the part I need for that particular unit, and where do I get it? Okay, so those are the two pain points. Blockchain is really designed to do exactly that. In blockchain, you would tie all of the information to an individual asset, to its model, its brand, its model, its serial number. So it is like a lifelong logistical supply chain, if you want, or logical supply chain, that will always keep track of what that asset has consumed, what it needs, what it's doing, and so forth, across its entire life cycle, regardless of how many different sources it has in terms of getting service information, service work, parts, and so forth. So for the information side, we said there's information transaction. For the information side, you always attach serial number service requirements to that asset. Wherever it is, whatever it's doing, it'll follow it around. And you also attach a service history to that asset. So when you buy that asset used, let's say, it comes attached with its whole, not just the birth certificate, but its entire transcript of what it's been doing since it got into service. And for the transaction side, parts need to be there as an individual asset. What parts has it been using? What parts does it need going forward? And again, the entire transaction history is there. If you have all of this, if you turn it into this truly equipment-centric environment, which, by the way, we've already done in the industry in different ways. We've used platforms to make sure that every asset is being pinpoint, followed with service information and so forth. But when we really start applying blockchain in this kind of world, a lot of the pain points should start coming down. I haven't spoken to too many people, including massive blockchain enthusiasts, that think this is imminent in this particular industry. It is for some very specific applications where timing is critical, like mining and some other sides, but it is something that is coming. And by the way, for those of you who are not that deep with blockchain, even though it's often conflated, blockchain is not Bitcoin. Bitcoin requires blockchain, but this is not proposing that there's a future for Bitcoin. It's purely on the blockchain of these supply chains. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the actual numbers. We already mentioned them, but let's go there. And now we don't just want to, you see in the middle column, if you can read that eye chart, on the left side I've got parts, service, and back office, and uptime. Those are the four drivers that we covered so far. And we quantified them: parts, 3% of OEC; service, another 3% of OEC; back office, 0.75 to 1% of OEC. And then we already said, gave some lip service, and we'll get a little deeper. Uptime is going to be far more expensive than any of those. But before we even go into that, let's figure how much can you actually do on behalf of your company, your fleet, to bring those costs down. Now, every single person that's been involved in parts purchasing has spent a very significant amount of their time looking at optimizing parts expense. That's a very flashy way of saying, quite often, where can I get this thing cheaper? Okay? So we're constantly negotiating with OEMs. We're constantly going to non-OEM sources. We are often threatening to go to non-OEM sources to get better discounts. And we're looking at alternatives all the time to get that 3% down. But if you take a big step back and say, how much can you really get that 3% to come down by? It's maybe 10%. Not 10%, but 10% of that 3%. Okay, you might get a discount. If you have a lot of leverage, you might go to the OEM and say, look, we'll continue to buy your parts, but we need 10, 15% of a discount to do that. If that's the case, then you'll see the relative improvement is 10 to 15%, which means, going back to our original denominator, total improvement as a percentage of OEC, you may have an impact of 0.3 to 0.45% on your equipment cost. And yet we're really focused on this part. We're constantly focused on how do we squeeze the supplier, how do we make these parts less expensive to get that additional 0.3 to 0.45. Now, if you go to the next level, service, operational efficiency, and you're looking at all the technology I referred to, whether it's BIM, to make sure the right people are there at the right time, whether it's that integration to make sure that that service information gets pinpoint delivered to my fleet and so forth, that 3%, you can easily reduce very, very quickly with technology that's available today off the shelf, off your SaaS cloud, easily by over 50%. Okay? And what that means in practice, by the way, is that the same service guys can easily do twice as much in one day because they're not chasing, they're not putting the wrench down, chasing the information comes to them. Okay? And that number keeps going up, and there's still a lot of room for it to go up. So if you're looking at that, unlike 0.3 to 0.45% of your OEC, you can get 1.5% out of that. We had I visited a European rental company, and they put in a transactional system, and their idea was to really start cross-referencing. They said that every time we order a part, I want my system to tell my several thousand employees in 400 different locations, no, don't buy that there, buy it here. And that's why we bought the system. Once we installed the system, we suddenly realized, wait a minute, with the system, we are now able to drive the service processes into the field. And we're now saving an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours for our service guys. So instead of that, maybe 10 euros that we can save on that transaction on a 40 euro part, we can now save 200 euros by doubling the throughput for that particular technician. And so after the procurement system was set in, because it was all inextricably tied to service, they said, forget the part stuff, we can focus on that another time. Let's focus on the big stuff, which is that second line, service. And then the third one, what's really nice about that, is if you're getting parts and service under control, meaning that the ordering is automated, the pricing is always correct, the serial number specifics are there, your own inventory starts getting optimized, you can fully automate the back office. Okay? So even though that is the smallest part service, back office was 0.75% in this, you can really just make that go away. And it is being made to go away today with a lot of these fleets, so that you can eliminate entirely. So you can, if you look at the relative, you can either keep focusing on parts discounts with a 0.3%, you can go to 1.5%, and another 0.75%. So you can immediately go to focus on those 2.5% instead of the original thing. But even those are relatively small, much, much bigger than how we think of parts costs, but smaller when we start including uptime. And that's where I said earlier, it's hard to quantify because it's different. You calculate the impact different, the situations are different, but here are 3 examples. The first thing that's beautiful is uptime. You don't have to do anything to improve uptime. You just have to get service and back office in line. Okay? If you fix service, and that's for very, very simple reasons. For every hour you save in service, it means you've improved uptime by 1 hour. It's as simple as that. It's hour for hour. So a lot of people say, hey, we have this technology, we have this feel that our uptime has improved a great deal, but we can't really measure it because there are all these other factors as well. And then our answer is usually, well, you don't have to measure it. How many hours have you saved for a service on some kind of normalized basis? And they'll give you a number and say, well, there's your uptime number. Now, whether it's being put to use in that additional time, whether it's being rented, whether it's being put on a construction site, that's a different issue. But even if it's not being used, and over time you can reduce your fleet and still have that same level of activity because your uptime has been improved. So what's nice about that is it's an automatic byproduct of getting service and back office in line. So, and that's the highest by far savings. So how do we measure it? You have three different ways. The first one is, do I need what I said in the very beginning, to make sure I don't get that penalty on that side, to make sure that I don't have a bad reputation because I don't deliver, let's just have some surplus fleet to absorb downtime of when it happens. That's one possibility to measure it. Do I need to rent equipment? If my own fleet is down, let's go out and what does that cost of that particular rental? I can quantify that. And it'll tell me, I can tell you to the penny what I spent last year in rental, and I can tell you among those rental projects, which of those were there because my own machine failed, and again, that's another way to measure that. And the third one is, what kind of penalties do I face? Do I lose this job altogether because of delays, and how much does that cost me typically? So I have some sense of my business on what that is. So the answer to this, for the first one is, what percentage point of improved availability do you have? What does each of those rental reduction points cost you? So there are numbers to all of this. And what is that delay? How much is that delay going to cost you? So there are different ways of doing it, and you have all of those available to you. Regardless of measure, uptime is by far the most expensive cost. And again, it's tied into the whole parts and service side. So preliminary conclusions. Every hour saved in labor is an hour of improved uptime. We covered that. Operational efficiency improvements are the largest cost savings, plus the largest over. So they result in the direct cost savings because you now don't spend as much on service on a per location, on a per repair basis. But because you're also pulling through the whole uptime improvement and everything else, they're also the largest overall cost savings. You're saving the amount of money you're spending on technicians, and at the same time, on a per job basis, and at the same time, as a consequence, you're solving the back office, and you're also getting better uptime out of it. And the lesson here that we already mentioned is don't spend too much time looking for less expensive parts. Look at improving operational efficiency. So if your original savings potential on parts by going less expensive is less than 0.5% of OEC, the operating impact of that is going to be easily take you up to as much as 10% in all of this. So that's really where the focus ideally should be. So what do we do? What does automation actually do? What do these solutions look like? So here's a simple illustration. First of all, there are a lot of technologies out there. Some of them call themselves networks. And the idea is for a manufacturer to not just say, come to my website and look at this, or look at, in the old days, look at CD-ROM, in the really old days, here's my microfiche. It is, let me, because we integrate with your fleet management in real time, just like we do in that BIM world, let me deliver to you the right service documentation whenever you need it. We will recognize your model, your serial number, we know the most current, and so that when your technician starts working on a job with their iPad, with their phone, boom, they just put in their asset number and they have all the drawings that they require to do their repair. That exists today. OEMs increasingly have taken responsibility for that for two reasons. One is the manufacturer has changed their role. It's no longer selling you equipment and just selling you parts. They're now actually starting to sell you uptime with that. They're going to start showing you performances because they're actually helping you with your service project, whether you're using dealer labor or their own labor, or whether it's your employees that are doing the repair. So that's one big form that's ongoing today and has been for the last 15 years. The other one is administrative workflow and transactions. When we looked at the guy with the wrench, some of these models that were there were about filling out work orders, purchase requisition, purchase orders. Well, if you already have that tie with your suppliers, and they change a part number, and it updates in your system, and the pricing is already there, why are we rekeying this in? It's integrated. So go ahead and say, I need this part, that part for this particular asset. Have the system generate the work order with all of these in there. Have the system generate the purchase requisition, which immediately goes to your boss. Your boss will look at it on his phone or her phone, and it will say, okay, I need these 3 parts. The machine is only 2 years old. It's worth this much. The parts are worth $500 it's worth it, yes, go ahead, and it releases the order. Okay? Don't run around with the wrench down, just have that automatically, that workflow happen, and it happens. Back office administration. When your manufacturer changes a part number, that should filter right all the way through to your item master. Okay? When you're trying to order something that no longer exists because the part number or the part description has changed, have there be a loop that then automatically updates yours. So now the manufacturer is no longer sending you just equipment, not just uptime either. They're starting to manage your back office, your administrative side for you as well, because when prices change at the dealer level or at the manufacturer level, regardless of depending on where you buy it, that automation happens there as well. Here's a quick illustration. Here's a diagram. This again was taken from a Dutch customer in this case, or a Dutch partner that we know, and the way we've been involved in a lot of their various technologies. Manufacturers pinpoint deliver it to the asset. And by the way, for the manufacturer, it's great, not just because they're providing customer service, but for them and their dealers, the cost of supporting the customer, the quality of that support has gone up, but the cost of them doing it manually, by picking up the phone and answering the same question about the same part 50 times in one day, that all goes away. It's great for them as well. This is sort of efficiency all the way through. It's a real win-win. Okay? So they're delivering all of this to the asset specifically. You then go ahead and say, okay, here are the materials. Let me look at my own stock information and what is it. And if I need the part and it gets approved by my boss, then we go ahead and electronically just send that order back to the supplier. Whether that supplier is the manufacturer or their dealer or third party altogether. Okay? So very simple illustration of what those kinds of technologies look like. Two more. Service scheduling. On a different note, there's been a lot of development in the last 10, 12 years on service workflow projects, where you actually track all of your employees. You know, so-and-so is an expert in hydraulics, another person does other stuff, and you go ahead and you put them to work. And you will schedule, depending on the priority of what equipment you need when, together with who's available when, you just go ahead and have that workflow being handled. And then what's really interesting, and I know we have companies like TrackUnit and ZTR here and so forth, with the use of telematics, and especially now with these all what I call IoT, Internet of Things stacks, it becomes easier and easier to actually start predicting what is needed when. And that's where my old for it's called that whole field of big data and machine learning and all of this stuff is really important, because just by watching when machines tend to fail and in what circumstance, and by getting a live feed from the equipment and what it's doing and what its circumstance is, we're getting better. And there's a lot of stuff, really fascinating stuff happening right now that's there in driving, optimizing repair, and avoiding larger repair requirements through all this. Okay, conclusion in the 17 seconds I have. First of all, just very quick summary. Success and profitability of projects depends on coordinated inputs of labor, materials, and equipment. That's where we started, and that's where BIM is really the platform for it. Each of these inputs we talked about has its own supply chain. We focused on one for equipment, and it's really the most of the three. It's by far the most complicated and sophisticated supply chain, and it's the one that is also lends itself most to technology and streamlining it. Every percentage point efficiency improvement decreases direct cost, lower service cost, all the things we want, lower parts cost, but also the indirect cost, which often is sort of the tail that's wagging the dog, because it also automatically leads to uptime improvements, and that's where really the big value is. And uptime improvements are virtually always greater than direct cost reductions, but the paths are identical. If you solve the parts and service side, uptime will automatically follow. Okay? And you cannot give a talk on technology without, at least in some slide, usually the conclusion saying technology is a solution. So I had some space in the bottom, so I had to do that. So what do I do? What does that mean? And if I want to put this into practice, very last slide. To continue to beat this dead horse, don't focus too much on less expensive parts. Okay? Even if you do it well, by definition, there's only so much give that's available. The other stuff is right. So if your time is scarce, which for all of us it is, and I'm saying, how am I going to allocate my next 4 hours? More often than not, it's far better applied, not on looking for a less expensive part supplier, but by really looking at these other operational efficiencies. It's a multiple in terms of what's available to you there. Really focus, once you start doing this, really focus on metrics for uptime, cost, benefits for your organization. This is one of the very few areas where being obsessive really pays off. What does it really mean for me to have an additional hour of uptime, and why? And use that as a key performance indicator that keeps going and going, that you can track as you go. And then to really look at these solutions, one of the fact that all these solutions had in common that I mentioned or referred to in general, they're all integrated. They're all integrated with your business. They're looking at your financial systems. They're integrated with your workflow, ordering, and service systems. And they also tend to be integrated with your suppliers. These integrations is what makes that intelligence possible. Another one that is not for us to say, but we're hearing more and more, especially the sophisticated fleets, are choosing equipment not just in terms of how does it perform in the field, what's there, what's a service requirement, but what is the manufacturer's, the supplier's ability to deliver uptime, to deliver reliability, and my own service team through these kind of integrated platforms. And we've seen more and more here in Europe, in Japan, and in Australia, for example, and in all cases, more and more that in the negotiation with the manufacturer, with the supplier, that's a huge point. What can you do for me across the life cycle? Don't just sell me the equipment. What can you do? And not by sending me your service guys. What can you do so that my service people are doing the right thing and are not chasing information by putting down that wrench? There's a lot that can be done there. And then one thing that's mentioned again, if you are dependent slightly, partly at least, on rental fleets, look for those that can also help you with your BIM. That they can actually, they know how to, at the very least, they know how to interpret your data, and they're willing to be flexible in their supply by keeping an eye on where you are with your projects. So you're not ending up going from optimizing your fleet, but then renting inefficiently. You want that efficiency to be there as well. And then the very last part is really invest in these integrated service and procurement platforms. And always make sure that there's so many procurement systems out there, very, very few are capable of handling the sophistication and the complexities of equipment. They don't, most of them don't handle, actually very few of them handle supersession, serial number specific stuff, the service workflow and everything else. Okay. That was a lot of information squeezed into 49 minutes, so I apologize for that, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Make sure everybody goes to your the Equipment Shift app and rate the speaker. Alex, please. This is very important for future engagement.